Thrawn Ascendancy Lesser Evil is the final of the Ascendancy trilogy and is the novel that finally shows the tipping point of Thrawn being outed of the Chiss Ascendancy and set off finding a new life in the Empire, continuing with the same general formula as the previous two novels, but of course winding down the events of the series, as Thrawn pulls away from the society he swore to protect. This novel dropped November 2021, 7 months after the second book and 14 months after the first book. This book really being the key to Thrawn's long-term character arc in the main galaxy we see through 99% of Star Wars media. Thrawn Ascendancy Lesser Evil takes place in 18 BBY and follows a new threat to the Chiss, the Kilji, and their mysterious overlords, the Grisk, which are more or less a species that was leading the Nick Ardoon in the first novel and the Akbui in the second on their attempted conquest of the Ascendancy. The Grisk start attacking people throughout the Ascendancy, with the 9 ruling families not really wanting to do much to stop this growing threat, as seeds of tensions have been growing since the Akbui conflict almost sent the 9 families and the other 40 great families into a massive Chiss civil war. So Thrawn and his compatriots decide they must do something about it. Thrawn delivers the Magus to the planet Sunrise, and Thalia discovers more dark history about the Skywalkers' program and their mind-wiping stuff they use to keep the Skywalkers sane, since children have a hard time learning things following the trauma of leaving their homes and families. Kind of a take on the youngling stuff from the main Star Wars series where the Jedi are taken young. You get the idea. Shiri starts connecting in her mind with the Magus, who hopes to use her to touch the beyond and gain insight on future battles to attempt to have her species move away from the brink of extinction. All these plots converge, however, on the planet Sunrise, as Thrawn and his team, consisting of Arlani and the Vigilant, Zainda and the Grey Strike, Saramako and the Springhawk, and various other Chiss ship take on the Akbui, with Thrawn calling in favors from some loosely allied alien nations, eventually beating the Akbui and their leader Jixtus by employing a gravity well generator to feint defeat early, as well as make in-system micro-jumps to help get the advantage over the Jixtus fleet, something we kind of saw in the High Republic era books with the Nihil. Though when returning from the Ascendancy, Thrawn and his allies are not hailed as heroes entirely, with the family in disarray following the events of the past 3 novels. Ultimately, someone had to be the fall guy to ease the tension, and it was decided that Thrawn would be that someone, sentenced to exile for his involvement in the scheme. However, Thrawn did as Thrawn does, and this was partially part of his next scheme, since his meeting Anakin Skywalker in the Core Worlds in the first novel, Thrawn learns that the Clone Wars Anakin was fighting in has come to an end. His plan is to use his connections to get him placed on a trade route for the new governing body, the Imperials, to make connections and determine if they are threats to the Chiss, or could be brought in as allies, or if they have anything that would benefit the Chiss technologically. Thrawn, knowing at least for a time his Chiss operations would be covert, which is where the novel leaves us, and leads to the main canon Thrawn trilogy. There's also a side story about the origin of Thrawn's best friend and symbolic brother Thras, who Thrawn uses as sort of a political power balance for him, since Thrawn is politically inept mostly, and Thras not having an eye for Thrawn's strategy, which kind of balances the duo out. Eventually, Thras is killed off when on a mission in lesser space, or the main galaxy as we know it, something that largely pulls the situation from the Legends novel Outbound Flight into canon, and takes lines directly from that novel as well, to kind of convey that most of those events happened later on. It is worth noting the ship he dies on and its mission has yet to be elaborated yet in canon, and the Outbound Flight novel from Legends wouldn't entirely work in canon, so it would have to be changed, but the situation mirrors his death in Legends aboard Outbound Flight, and confirms some things that went on during that novel have also happened in the main timeline. This is the sub-story told in Memories chapters, only being moderately relevant explaining the gravity well generator Thrawn uses in the final battle, but mostly to keep Thras from the Outbound Flight novel as part of Thrawn's origin in canon as well as legends and explain why he's dead. Thrawn is dealing with a new group of religious zealots, the Kilji, who, as you may be able to guess, have teamed up with Jixtus to cause issues for the Chiss. Following the battle at sunrise, Thrawn hates these pesky Grisk and their leader Jixtus, going on rogue campaigns with his friends and allies that tolerate him to fight this threat the Chiss bureaucracy refuses to actually address. This eventually leads to issues because despite his victory and the demise of the Grisk threat brought on by Jixtus, Thrawn is pushed into exile where he's eventually found by Emperor Palpatine, something that we will eventually talk about in more depth when I do my Outbound Flight video, which has an accompanying short story, Mist Encounter, which, while a Legends book, tells Thrawn's time in exile and more or less seems to be canon here. In reality, though, Thrawn also sort of pushed himself into exile, taking the fall for the insubordination, something his adversaries in the Chiss ruling family structure were happy to jump on. Thrawn ending the novel deciding he would go to lesser space to investigate what's happening within that sphere. He also has a subplot where he finds his biological sister, who he was separated from at birth, and there's some good stuff there, but to be completely honest, it isn't all that important to the wider narrative. Thrawn also notably has several memory segments with Thras, a character that is basically his best friend from his pre-service days, and a character that was being fleshed out from his appearance in Outbound Flight, which it is a bit of a change that they were so close. They were moderately close, and it was implied that they were actually flesh and blood brothers in the Outbound Flight novel, but that was changed here. Much of Thras's story would be pulled over from Legends wholesale. Otherwise, most of his story would be pulled wholesale from Outbound Flight. His death, though, was almost verbatim, though, as we already discussed, not 100%, since that wouldn't work in the modern continuity, and it was left vague enough that it wouldn't step on any canon outside of Zahn's books that much. In this book, he is with a female pilot who is in no way identified, where in canon he is accompanied by Lorenza Jinsler, a Jedi Knight and former student of Joruus C'baoth, who was the clone template for one of the major antagonists of the Heir to the Empire trilogy. Anyhow, we're veering a little bit off of relevant aspects for this book, but it's interesting to note anyways. Thras's death was also moved in the timeline from its original 27 BBY pre-Clone Wars post-Phantom Menace time to 19 BBY to fit with Thrawn's timeline shifting up a bit to better accommodate his timeline compared to the prequels, since here he meets Anakin Skywalker late in the Clone Wars. Thras is kind of a nerd and is more of a political element. He helps Thrawn keep afloat in politics and plays games and talks battle theories with Thrawn since he's inept in that field. It's a pretty fun duo, and his death is made more tragic from this book when compared to Legends, where he was far less fleshed out and a lot less close to Thrawn. Here you can see how that would personally affect Thrawn, and I found that kind of interesting. Aralani becomes more important to the plot. She initially in the books liked Thrawn, then became less able to kind of hang around him with all of the Thrawn drama of his insubordination and stuff, though finally in this book she came together with Thrawn realizing the gravity of his mission and isn't super happy about his eventual exile, but understands why he decided he was going to do it. Thalius helps Thrawn's sister, we mentioned earlier, and since his sister is involved in the Skywalker program, which ends up being a bit of an odd system, intentionally using techniques to make Skywalker's life before the program more muted and blurred, so that their connection to the third sight isn't dampened as much, creating a much stronger connection to it, though at a bit of a cost, which sort of reflects the Jedi practices with their Padawans. This is obviously morally devious and pisses off Thalius, but I find it to be fairly interesting, especially when we consider some philosophies within the Force. As I said, the Jedi use detachment to get a better grip on the light side and not have the attachments shadowing their judgment, and the dark side doesn't embrace attachment either. It would keep them from the power they're looking for. So this kind of explores this Chiss middle ground And I find it kind of interesting to see Thalius, who's almost acting as a sister to Thrawn, interact with his biological sister Borica, and kind of trying to grapple with her morally devious techniques that she uses to make more efficient Skywalkers, and kind of try to balance if she understands why they do it versus the practicality of it. Shiri is pushed to her limits as the Magus messes with her in her mind, forcing her to do riskier maneuvers like operating weapons systems. In the end, she's tasked with helping the Seeker program improve after moving on from the Springhawk, since the Chiss realize they need to do some amending to the program since it's not entirely healthy how they're treating the Skywalkers. Thurfian got his wish that Thrawn be exiled in this novel, though it's a small victory since Thurfian loves the Myth family, despite how much he goes against their best warrior, since he always feared Thrawn's great slip-up was coming and would harm the political and social standing of the Myth and their people. But at the same time, with Thrawn exiled, one of their greatest protectors and warriors, that could also present some problems, so it's a bit bittersweet for Thurfian. Jixtus is now leading the religious zealots of the Kilji, though when Thrawn and his ragtag team beat the Kilji and avoid his plan of a full Chiss civil war, Jixtus dies, refusing to be taken alive, which, if they were able to capture him, would teach the Chiss some information on the Grisk, which he refused to let them have, choosing death over that dishonor. It's kind of funny, I think the Yuuzhan Vong from Legends are sort of drip-fed across this trilogy. The Grisk taking their own story role as the far outsiders, the Kilji adopting the religious zealotism of the group, the Nick-Gardoon having this sense of destiny taking them to glory, and the Akbui being these really strange-looking aliens. I find that interesting, though I think in a way, Zahn pictured a different campaign than that of Legend, and that's why he changed it. Now, obviously, the Yuuzhan Vong are not canon, at least yet, but I would be kind of shocked if we didn't eventually see them pop up in some form or another. Such is the nature of modern media. But I kind of like this new take on these out-of-galaxy alien threats, and I think Jixtus and the Grisk are a fun threat, even if they might be a little muted compared to the Yuuzhan Vong, who are just absolutely brutal. The Kilji are really arrogant, but this is totally unearned, and they are pawns in Thrawn and Jixtus's game, really. Thras is a really great addition to further humanize Thrawn and give him some stuff to do other than to just be an expert warrior. It makes him a little bit more realistic. It shows he has friends and he isn't just this stone-cold warrior man with something of a heart peeking through. It's just another angle and kind of an addition to his arc with Thalius and Ar'alani and his other friends throughout the trilogy. One big thing in the books is breaking down the Ascendancy's strong political system. The problem, much like the Senate from Star Wars, and honestly the political situation in most organized governments, both fictional and real life, is that it's bogged down by bureaucracy. Thrawn stopped a civil war, saved the whole society and potentially millions of lives, but is still exiled following his decision to play the fall guy. Though all this politics made the book occasionally a little dry, not to mention the book is 576 pages, the audiobook being 24 hours long. It has a lot of time to gestate, being about twice as long as your average Star Wars novel. That said, the ship battles, and especially the final battle, is almost impossible to describe. It is so good. If you're a nerd for war logistics in a sci-fi setting, this is your series, and Timothy Zahn is absolutely unmatched in weaving these ginormous battles and describing how each piece sits on the board, so to speak. Or if, like me, you never really considered war strategy beyond finding a camping spot in Call of Duty, you'll learn a lot of interesting things, and it's kind of enthralling. Thrawn is a good guy in this book, through and through, and honestly, I haven't read the other canon Thrawn trilogy yet, but I will soon, because how Thrawn became evil is really, really hard to say here. Overall, I like the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy. They have a lot of pros, they have a lot of cons. I think this may be the best book for Thrawn material, since so much essential stuff happens, and it doesn't have the weight of confusing lore that Chaos Rising had to explain what's happening in this world and make the politics make sense. But since this book is coming at the end and it had 2 books to explain all that to you, it doesn't feel the need to push as much of this really heavy, weighty, and occasionally a bit boring, admittedly, stuff on you.